Loneliness is a terrible thing when you have exhausted pleasure and find you have come away empty-handed. And to you young students, I tell you, the world is yours out there with all kinds of pleasure. And the most pitiful state to reach is when you've exhausted it and find out that it really didn't take you anywhere. It didn't bring you what you thought it would. So meaning. What really brings meaning? What brings purpose in life? How do we find this in the sense of finding not just existential fulfillment, but a definitive purpose by which to measure where you are on this journey of life's meaning? I've traveled now for 4 decades, and I was raised with almost no money in my pocket ever. In fact, something very sad happened today, and some of you may know my story. And I came to know Christ when I was on a bed of suicide at the age of 17 in the city of Delhi. Tried to take my own life, totally empty. When a man walked into my hospital room and brought me a Bible and led me and gave that Bible, he couldn't stay because he wasn't allowed. I was in a pretty depleted state, my body dehydrated. He gave it to my mother, who struggled through the English and that and read it for me, whatever. But I made my commitment to Christ at the age of 17 on a bed of suicide. This morning I got the word that my friend who had come into that hospital room, he was in his late 70s, passed away last night. So I spoke to his daughter. She calls me Uncle Ravi now, and she said, Uncle Ravi, the last 3 weeks, he spent every day watching you on YouTube. I said, that's terrible. He could have got a better picture than that. She said, but you know, last week when I spoke to him on the phone, he said, Ravi, sometimes I think my whole purpose in this world was to bring you to Christ. And he says, I draw such great joy from that. And the reason I mentioned that, I told Tammy, his daughter, I said, Tam, when I phoned your dad last week to find out how he was doing, he asked me how I was doing financially. He said, can I send you something? I said, no, Fred, I'm fine. I said, I'm calling to just chat, find out how you are. And I said, you know, Tammy, when I was a young teenager, he'd drive us to the place where we were doing our Bible study and he'd sit in the front of the car and toss his wallet back into my hand. He said, let's go and get some Cokes and samosas and have some fun this evening. And we'd go and get ourselves some Coke, 6 or 7 of us in the car. I said, and your dad hardly had any income at that stage. That was the generosity with which he lived. So I was raised with very little. Not making a sob story, I'm just telling you that. Now it's my privilege to see people with a lot. I had dinner one night with the 7th wealthiest man in the world. I asked him, whatever brought you to inviting me to come and speak to your staff? He said, a little while ago, I phoned my wife from the 70th floor or something of my building, and I told her, I'm a very lonely man. She said, so am I. He said, what do we do? She said, I don't know, but there's a church opposite one of the apartment buildings we own. Maybe we should go there, then we won't have to pay for parking. And you know what he told me? When he could buy everything he wanted, he had never reached such a lonely moment as that. It's true. So think about it. What really brings life meaning? No moral point of reference, no meaning. Thirdly, quickly, there is no hope. Death becomes the end. And for all of those who want moral reasoning, I ask you, if death is the end, when that moment comes, there's ultimately no difference between a Mother Teresa and an Adolf Hitler. If there's no justice, if there's no judgment, ultimately there is really no comma or punctuation mark. It's a full stop. How does one really hold to a worldview where such are the ramifications of huge differences in lifestyles and values and ethics? I stood behind Mother Teresa on 2 or 3 occasions. In fact, I was asked by one of the leading televisions to come and anchor her funeral. I couldn't do that. But I remember this diminutive woman with all of her limited physical capacity, living with this little white sari around her. Sure, when she died, there were only 3 saris in her trunk. That's all she had. And yet, the homes she built, one is called Nirmal Hriday, which is a meets tender heart, watching how she rescued the masses in Calcutta and many other parts of the globe. A woman who gave herself to such incredible sacrifice. And what does Hitchens do with a life like that? Writes a vulgarly titled book called The Missionary Position. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, all of them were at her funeral to recognize her as one of the great luminaries of our time who lived with such sacrifice and such selflessness. Do we not see the difference? Do we not see the difference? On what basis? No moral law, no meaning, no hope. You know, it's amazing what death does to a human life when you've lost somebody near and dear. I was in my 20s when I lost my mom. She was in her 50s. You look at life from a different paradigm at that moment. The great philosopher, theologian, Nicholas Wolterstorff, taught at Yale. He's in his 80s. Wolterstorff made this comment after he lost his son in a mountain climbing accident. He says, you know, when we have finished conquering absence with a cell phone, conquering heat with our air conditioners, conquering our winglessness with airplanes, conquering distances with transportation, we'll still end up having to deal with the evil in our heart and death. The whole hope of the resurrection, we've just celebrated Easter. Regardless of what you think about it, there's a logical flow to it. And I ask you this question. It was Thomas Aquinas who said the thing that intrigued him most about the disciples who are willing to pay with their lives is that they weren't in a herd mentality, all of them sitting in one room saying, bravo, let's die for this. They all died alone in different settings. Peter, Paul, they didn't do this for some kind of a hallucination experience in their background. They came to the realization that the risen Christ had redefined all of history for them, and that's why carried his message everywhere. Hope, hope beyond the grave, hope for now. Without God, I find no point of reference for morality except self-referencing. No ultimate point of reference for meaning except whatever you choose to give to yourself. No ultimate hope beyond the grave. And finally, if one is wrong in all of these choices, then you say to yourself, what is the recovery line? Where do I turn now for recourse when everything else I lived for was contrary to what I now think I must face? That's why Jean-Paul Sartre found himself literally on his deathbed saying, I found my philosophy unlivable. And his mistress standing by his bedside said he's losing his mind. Maybe for the first time then he really found it. I don't know where you're at in your life, but I want to say to you, the abandoning of God leaves you with some extraordinarily tough questions. Moral law, hope, meaning, and if all goes wrong as you're coming to the end and you say, I've got to change my mind, what then? I think in my postgraduate work studying some of the great philosophers, especially Anthony Flew in his atheism, having to respond to Flew during my days at Cambridge there. And then, of course, all of a sudden, a few years ago, Flew says he's no longer an atheist. I thought I wasted all my time and all these years, and the boys... but he described himself as best a deist. But he did go on to say, if there is a truth, it'll have to be in the person of Jesus Christ. And so I say to you, when you're thinking of all that it costs, think of that's what Pascal meant existentially, not as a last-minute wager. He said, the existentialist challenges me and asks me, what if I'm wrong? He said, well, existentially, I'm fulfilled. I've nothing to lose. I'm a happy man. And at the end of my life, if it's wrong, then I've no way to regret what I found my happiness in. But how inestimable is the loss of one who rejects God and finds out he or she was wrong. That was what the Pascalian wager was all about. And so I leave you with the challenge to ask you to think about the truth of what I have just said to you. And I leave you with two quotes, and then I end. Viktor Frankl. Somebody was talking to me about Ernest Gordon, who was your chaplain some years ago. I remember reading his book. They're just a brilliant, brilliant writer. And Ernest Gordon, too, had been in concentration camp, as was Viktor Frankl. Frankl says this: if we present man with a concept of man, which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instincts, heredity, and environment, we will then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry of defense other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. So an academy like this has an immense responsibility on what it does behind its lecterns and its lecture halls, and what it imparts to you. Matthew Paris is a prominent journalist in the United Kingdom, an atheist and with a lifestyle that would be very contrary to the theistic framework. He was raised in Malawi, and he went to Malawi 2 Christmases ago, and he came back and he wrote a stunning article in the Times. He said, I find myself shocked that I'm about to say what I'm going to say. He said, because it challenges every philosophical bone in my body. He said, as one who has lived disavowing God and as an atheist, I'm staggered by the fact of what I'm seeing and about to state in this article. He said, Africa is in serious trouble. And he goes on to describe all that is going on there. He says, and if something doesn't happen, it'll end up with the sinister mix of Nike and the machete at the same time. And he says, what I've concluded is this: Africa doesn't just need another ethical theory. He said, what I saw with my own eyes was what the Christian gospel did for the people, how that new birth changed their hearts. He said, I'm amazed that I'm saying things like this. He said, and yet I'm convinced an ethical theory is not what the African continent needs. It needs the gospel of regeneration and the gospel of redemption. I would have just added one footnote to Mr. Paris's words. Mr. Paris, not just Africa, the whole world. That's what the whole world needs. Why am I not an atheist? I simply cannot build a life coherently with life's deepest questions that continue to haunt when you're running from God. I leave that with you for thought, and will respond to your questions along with Vince Vitale. Thank you very much.
All right. First off, thank you, Mr. Zacharias, for coming. It's really a privilege to have you here. This question is just, you have the ability to rationalize through what I believe to be a spiritual experience. So I'm wondering, if you've had doubts that you were not able to rationalize through, and if so, how you got through that.
If I've ever had any doubts, and how I have worked myself and my reasoning process through them. You know, when you go back to the history of academics and how they've arrived at certainty, you can go back across 5 centuries and you'll see how it started with rationalism, that indubitable certainty, and so mathematics became that where Descartes said the only reason you even knew he existed was because he doubted, therefore he was. So they were looking for rational, indubitable certainty. From rationalism we moved to empiricism, where the verification principle and the scientific worldview, the positivistic theories all took over. On the heels of that came those who struggled with emotional issues and their personal subjectivity. Existentialism took over. So you had rationalism, empiricism, existentialism, and you came into on the verge of the 21st century, postmodernism came over, and basically that didn't believe in any absolutes, that did away with truth, meaning, and certainty. The mistake that was sometimes made along this journey is that in grabbing the finger of one way of truth testing, they thought they grabbed the fist of all of reality. There are rational tests, but so are there empirical tests, so are there existential tests, and so is the whole search for community, which is what postmodernism ultimately led us to. So in taking measures of truth verification, the confluence and convergence of all of these is a critical point at which you have to come. Some things are rationally explained, some things existentially undeniable, others you find empirically verifiable, and you bring all of these to the test. So whenever after I made my Christian journey, after I began my Christian journey and made that commitment to Christ, my own transformation was so dramatic, as was my father's, who was very hostile to my initial response and actually almost marginalized me in the process till he came to become a follower of Christ himself. That I have had so serious, I think, an encounter in that relationship, I can honestly tell you I have never doubted that relationship with Christ or God himself. Have I had questions along the way? Yes. Some very serious questions. And you have to settle a question after debating it. You don't settle it before debating it. You go through. I've read authors, I talk to others, I check this out against with other people's thinking and so forth. When I bring these points of convergence, I find the Christian truth to meet two tests of logic: correspondence theory, coherence theory. Individual assertions correspond to reality. The whole system teaching put together brings a coherent worldview. That's the way I see that. Then in life itself, the twin realities of truth and relevance. I find it very relevant in my life every day. My decisions are not made ad hoc. They're made on the basis of a prior commitment that life at its core is sacred. So to answer your question, yes, you will always have questions. You will always struggle with questions. But as C.S. Lewis would say, you don't go all the way back to the beginning. You take one or two steps back to see how you deal with that question before you start moving forward. So personally, the doubt has never been a factor, but the question has. Now, I know some people who wrestle with great doubts, and I with great sympathy help them and deal with them because they're trying to struggle mainly with the intellectual component of their faith. Or sometimes experientially, they've gone through a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, and they just cannot put this whole story together in the light of the gospel. So you have to deal with the convergence of these points of reference, and at times where the intellectual may be weak, the experiential does carry you through till the intellect catches up with what you are living with and going through.
Thank you. My question is a different perspective on the first subject of the question, which was belief versus doubt. You mentioned that you have no problem with doubt now, but it struck me that during your entire talk, you gave reasons for belief which were instrumental in the sense that this are the good things that would happen if you believe. And I did not hear any reasons for believing that this is true. And I think there's a big difference between reasons to believe a truth versus reasons to believe that good things might come if you believe this, whether or not it's true. And along the same lines, it also struck me that you passed over what I would consider to be the strongest evidence that there is no God, which is evil. If I would see a death camp, rather than think that that's a reason to believe in God, I would think that's a reason not to believe in God. And I'd appreciate your response.
I appreciate your candor very, very much. And yes, I think that's probably, it's oftentimes they say virtue in distress and vice in triumph has made atheists of mankind, that you see this kind of evil and this kind of suffering. But let me go back to your first comment, which was an important one, that I didn't present any reasons to believe in God. I just presented reasons why I'm not an atheist. I was trying to stay with the subject matter that is given to me. In fact, tomorrow night you're welcome to where I'm going to be. I'm going to present my defense of Christianity. And maybe they'll tell you where that will be, and I will give you the reasons very clearly there. But for now, let me just give you maybe 2 or 3 of them that I think will enable me to at least get past the hurdle. The question you've raised is germane to one of my own arguments in the beginning. If evil is real and not a construct in our own mind, and evil is truly something to be shunned and is morally deviant, then there is no way to sustain that without a moral being who's the creator of this universe. And let me give that in 2 illustrations for you. See, when a person says there's such a thing as evil, they assume there's such a thing as good. When they assume there's such a thing as good, they're assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But when they assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil, they have to posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What becomes really of the question? So here's what I want to say to you. Out of these 4 steps, from evil to good to the moral law to the moral lawgiver, the one that you could really quibble with and say, Ravi, why do I have to come up with a moral lawgiver in order to sustain a moral law or to go to good and go to evil? And the reason is this: whenever a question of evil is raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person. It is either raised by a person or about a person, which assumes, therefore, persons have intrinsic worth. And that is not a legitimate offspring ideationally of a non-theistic universe. How does one give essential worth to a product of time plus matter plus chance? So when you assume that there is implicit worth in personhood, you're actually assuming that the person is a created being by one of intrinsic and implicit worth. Now, if you go, for example, to the pantheistic worldview, all is God, God is all, you are part of the pantheistic worldview in the cycle of birth and rebirth. If you come, for example, to the Islamic worldview and you talk about God, God is so distant that you cannot really truly make too many propositional statements about him. The distance is so great between the sovereign God and the finite human. A person came to Jesus and he said to Jesus, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? I've just filed my taxes 3 days ago and I wish Jesus had answered this question differently. Because at the same time, it would be wonderful to be both godly and rebellious, you know. But Jesus looked at him and said, do you have a coin? And the man said, yes. He said, show it to me. So Jesus took the coin and said, whose image do you see on this coin? The man said, Caesar. Jesus said, give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and give to God that which belongs to God. The man ought to have had a follow-up question. The follow-up question should have been, what belongs to God? Jesus would have said to him, whose image is on you? This intrinsic worth that Jesus gives to you and me, sir, is an undeniable expression of my starting point that my questions are valuable because at core my essence is valuable. And when I see a deviation from it, I have a legitimate reason to ask that question. The problem of evil is delegitimized in a naturalistic framework. That's why Richard Dawkins, although Peter Singer here takes issue with Richard Dawkins, but Richard Dawkins' comment is fascinating. He said, I have to come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as evil. We are merely dancing to our DNA. Dawkins is being more consistent. He says that if I assume the reality of evil, I have to posit a transcendent basis on which to measure it. So I can't afford to accept the reality of evil. So I say to you, the question of evil and moral reasoning points me to a transcendent moral lawgiver. And if I take the offer on the cross for forgiveness and grace, which is what we all desperately need, without which we won't make it. And the theory of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, the Christian worldview presents to me a coherence of intrinsic worth and the resultant way in which we live, loving God and loving our fellow human being. 613 laws were given to Moses. David reduced it to 15. Isaiah to 11. Micah to 3. When Jesus was asked which is the greatest law, he didn't reduce it to 1. He said to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He said on these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets. Because of the first, the second follows. Without the first, the second doesn't follow at all. It's with its feet firmly planted in midair. So the existential ramifications of knowing God and the intrinsic worth of my neighbor and my own life gives me the defense of theism much more than atheism can defend these two very issues. So I will give you a more lengthy answer on this if you come tomorrow, but I think implicit in the not of atheism is the yes of theism. It gives me meaning, gives me hope, gives me the recovery, and more than anything else describes my intrinsic worth and what it means to be human. My honor to be with you here at Princeton.
When I was in Germany,
India, very close to Bangladesh,
George Washington University,
the Middle East,
meetings in Angola,
United States,
from China,
in Canada,
in the United Kingdom,
in Istanbul, in Ankara and Izmir,
Romania,
at American University,
at the University of Harvard,
Manila in the Philippines,
Perth, Australia,
to South Africa,
in Africa.
So the global family of humanity is really like what John Wesley would have said, the world is our parish.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 921-939, Norcross, Georgia, 30010. Let My People Think is a listener-supported television ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.
One of the most thrilling aspects of RZIM is Wellspring International. Many of you are familiar with it. It's the humanitarian arm of what we do. And Wellspring this last year had done several major projects. Among them was Zamar Academy, the school for children from the so-called lowest class and unable to support themselves. How much was accomplished by Wellspring procuring the land and beginning the building. These kids now can get an education that'll help them qualify all the way into higher education because of the leadership of Wellspring and the vision. And then there was Agni Raksha, the burn victims project that Wellspring had in Bangalore. Women who'd been burned with all kinds of abuse, and the various units that were planted and built because of Wellspring. Your generosity made it possible. Thank you for standing with us. Please continue doing that as Wellspring reaches out the hands of Christ, apologetics with a touch, bringing the rescue of God to the hurting of this world. God bless you.